Expedition 44 here with Matt and Ryan. We are getting ready to invoke on part 3 of our Eschatology Series. Today we are going to talk covenants. And covenants kind of get a little bit of a bad rap. I have a THD from Covenant Evangelical Seminary, and I tell that to a lot of people that kind of know me and my theology, and it kind of raises an eyebrow sometimes. It kind of raises an eyebrow because they think, is that Reformed?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when you hear covenant theology, you think of Reformed theology.
There's a lot of different religious organizations, churches, denominations that have grasped the word covenant. And today I think that people just don't understand really what covenant theology means. And like I said, it kind of has gotten almost a negative connotation when, honestly, I love the word covenant. It's one of my favorite things about the Bible.
Yeah, it's all over the Bible.
So you can't make it a bad word. You can't take it out of the Bible. And so today we're going to talk about covenant thinking, covenant theology, and we're going to talk about it from the pretense of what does that mean throughout the entire lens or view of the entire Bible.
Yeah, so we've been doing a series here on Eschatology End Times. And so we're going to show you how your view of the covenants and your view of how God relates to Israel and God relates to us as Gentiles will really affect the way that you view end times. And that's why we have this episode in our end times, playlist.
Yeah. Now, one thing that is, it might sound funny to start this way, but it's really crucial to this conversation, is to ask, is Jesus on the throne right now?
I would say yes. I mean, Hebrews 8:1 and 12:2 say that. You have it all over. Romans chapter 8 says as well. I mean, you got it a bunch of places. He's at the right hand of God.
So at the time of Christ, people were looking for a Messiah. And they were looking for this to be in the form of really a revolution, almost a revolt, you might even say, against the Roman government. They were looking for a physical king to come into what everybody wanted was they wanted for him to overthrow and rule the world, because they were thinking empirically at that point. Yet that's not what happened.
No.
So when we talk about Christ being king, you hear that a lot.
We talked about that in what the gospel is Jesus is king.
Yeah.
So
it's important, but people are still kind of thinking that they want this literal reign. What do we do with that?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because people will see that they'll look at like the way you look at the millennium. The millennial reign is only Jesus becomes king then. Yeah. And then there's other views like the amillennial version, which sees Jesus as king now. And so there's different ways to look at that. So we're not necessarily going to answer all those questions right now, but you need to start thinking this way because these covenants are going to flush into that kind of thinking. And so let's just jump into it. The first one that you kind of hear is supersessionism. Yeah, so in dispensationalism or futurism, there's usually a split distinction between the church and Israel. So the church, they consider that Gentiles, or even just Jews that believe in Jesus. In some views, there's part of that. And then the whole Jewish ethnic Jews, that they're split, and God has a plan for each of them. And then we see the rapture, which takes the church out because God can't deal with both at the same time.
Another word for this is replacement theology, and that makes more sense to people.
Yeah, so the replacement theology is that the promises made to Israel have been replaced by the church, which dispensationalism or futurism doesn't take that view.
Now, what about an expansion of Israel? You hear that sometimes too.
Yeah, and that kind of falls more into the covenant thinking, is that the church is, as in Romans 11, the believing Gentiles are grafted into the root, and there's debate on what the root is. I believe it's covenants. So
and then what about the idea that there's Israel and then there's the New Testament church?
Yeah, and that's what I was talking about with dispensationalism, futurism. There's a split distinction, and a lot of people think, and that's what most dispensationalists, futurists, believe, that God has this special purpose still for Israel that wasn't fulfilled in Jesus.
Now, people know terminology for the millennial. So when you're talking pre-mill, amill, where does that land with these different things?
So we're talking about Jesus as king when with pre-mill, it means before the millennium starts, Jesus comes back and establishes his kingdom on earth. Amill believes that there's a spiritual reign of Jesus from when he ascended all the way through when he comes back. And post-millennium is that we're here working with the Spirit to establish the kingdom of God on earth, and when that is established to whatever certain marker, I don't know, that Christ will come back at that time.
Yeah. So what about fulfillment theology? That word's out there too.
Yeah, I think fulfillment and replacement theology go hand in hand. Kind of replacement theology is a dirty word used by dispensationalists to say that the church has replaced that, where people who fall into the replacement theology camp will call it fulfillment theology because they believe Jesus has fulfilled all the promises to Israel, and that really it's the remnant, the believing Jews and the believing Gentiles are the true Israel.
Yeah. So when you talk about covenants, all these have kind of a root in a covenant system. Mm-hmm. And so when you say covenant, that's talking about a deal, kind of, a relationship between God and man or men. And so it's a promise. Mm-hmm. What do these promises look like? How do we shape out? You see, we have some promises that seem to be based on, if this happens, then this will happen. Yep. And then some of them are just
outright promises.
This is just the way it is. Yeah.
It's God's deal, and you don't have to do anything to make it happen.
So when we talk about covenants in terms of eschatology, what are we really talking about here?
So there's promises made to Abraham back in Genesis 12, Genesis 17, and dispensationalists think that not all these promises have been fulfilled yet. Yeah. Covenant people see that maybe they're still in the process of being filled, but they're pretty much done. Yeah. Replacement believe that this has all been transferred to the church, and Israel doesn't have a part in it anymore. So those are kind of the views. So we got the Abrahamic Covenant. So God promised to give Abraham land, a nation, and that all nations would be blessed in him. Yeah. So we kind of see that.
So there's this idea here where going into the covenants, there seems to always be a people and a place, and usually a king's on part of that too, and that is very tied into sacred space, like you and I always talk.
And temple talk.
Yeah,
and
temple
that
too.
Talk, Yep. Then we have the Sinai Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant. So we know that as the Torah, the 613 laws of the Old Testament. And so those are very conditional. Yeah. Yeah, we see, pretty much outright everybody agrees that if not following those ends up in exile. Right. Pretty much explicitly says that. That is a conditional one. The Davidic Covenant, 2 Samuel 7, where God promises David that he will have basically an heir on the throne forever.
Yeah. And so is that conditional?
No, I don't believe that it is. Physically, maybe, but spiritually, we see it fulfilled in Jesus. Yeah. David's kids went awry, and God sent them into exile, and that kind of ties back into the Torah thing. Right. So when they're going off and worshiping other gods, God doesn't tolerate that too much. Right.
And then we have the New Covenant. And people are a lot more familiar with the New Covenant because we talk about it all the time. We have communion, and you might use the word New Covenant. Jesus talked about it. People are a lot more familiar sometimes with the New Testament than they are with the Old Testament. And so they get the New Covenant. But specifically, what does that speak to?
It speaks to, Israel kept disobeying, and they couldn't keep their end of the bargain.
And over.
So God's saying he's making a new covenant, but he's imparting the ability to obey. It's going to be written on our hearts.
Yeah. So the idea back in the day when God said, "These are my people," and we talk about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of, these fallen beings come down who are supposed to connect the dots with God and be supported there, yet they end up getting worship and accept this worship and falling themselves, and all these nations go out, and God basically just says, "I'm going to focus on Israel here. This is going to be my portion. This is my chosen people, but I'm going to use them to go back and to regather the nations later."
Yeah, it was ultimately the plan of the promise with Abraham.
Did it happen?
In Jesus.
In Jesus. So we look at Israel failing over and over and over and over, yet the Messiah came from that lineage.
Yep, and that was the whole purpose. We talk about the Mosaic laws, the stopgap, trying to keep Israel in line until that redeeming Messiah came.
So some people see that these land promises to Abraham were never fulfilled. They look at this and they read the Bible and they say, I can't find a place in the Bible where that was fulfilled.
Well, they're wrong. So you even look in Joshua 21:43-45, it says they possessed all the land that God had given them. Yeah. And then we got 1 Kings 4:21-24. Under Solomon, it says they possessed all the land that God had promised. Right. It's kind of hard to refute it when it says all of the land that God had promised was fulfilled in two separate spots.
Now, is this always where people live? I think that's kind of the connotation, is that people consider this as being, did Israel live there? And that's why this is such a big hot topic right now, because it really hasn't been recognized that Israel has their own land right now even.
Yeah, it's kind of in turmoil.
Yeah. And so it's a hot topic, and that's why you might wonder how this all ties into eschatology, but that's part of the equation here. Yeah. The New Testament is clear that this place is the entire world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Romans chapter 4 says that, basically indicates that it's going to be everything.
So if I'm reading the Bible, I'm saying, what is God's land? What is this land that started with this Old Testament covenant? Is it actually a place? Is it an idea? Is it a spiritual thing in my head? What is it?
Well, the whole cosmos belongs to God. It's all his temple, and he wants for his space and our space to overlap.
So according to the covenants, are we there yet?
I wouldn't say 100%, but it's broken in.
It's like we're working through that.
Already not yet. We say that over and over.
All right, so let's talk about Israel for a second. That's the punch word right here.
How do we define it?
Where does Israel fall? So Galatians 3 speaks to this a little bit. What does it say?
Well, it talks about the church inheriting the promises to Abraham. But then it refers only to the seed right after that. So which is Jesus. So in Jesus, he's the true faithful Israelite. We see over and over, if you look at the Gospels narratively, that he's painted as taking on the entire story of Israel. And then we see this participation language all throughout the epistles, that when we participate in Jesus, we're participating in Israel's promises.
What does it links to the Great Commission. And so when you're talking about all of these promises and you read the Great Commission to go get this, is it simply land that he's talking about with the Great Commission?
No, he's talking about regathering the nations. I mean, the land, when Jesus defeated the powers on the cross, which were over these territories, he's regathered the land, and now he's establishing a kingdom with people as him as the king.
All right. So another place that this comes in is Romans 9, 10, 11. People read this set of chapters very differently.
Yeah. So in Romans 9, we see that Paul refers to Israel's as national Israelites, Jews, ethnic Israelites. But then he also refers to non-Jews as Israelites, the spiritual Israel. So he kind of has like this overlapping significance of them.
And you wonder what's going on here. Is it a grafting? Is it an inheritance? What kind of language is this?
So we talk about remnant theology a lot. So the remnant in the Old Testament, where during the time of exile and the time where Israel was being unfaithful to God and going off and worshiping other gods, there was always a small group that continued to worship him and that he used for his purposes. Here in Paul's time in Romans 9, he's saying that, not all the Jews are turning to me, but there is a faithful remnant, and he uses that same story of Elijah when he's complaining about him being the only one left. And he says, I have 7,000 reserved, the remnant. So it seems that Israel is kind of the grafting in, is that olive tree picture in Romans 11 of the unfaithful being cut off. The faithful being, the unnatural branches being grafted into the root, which I believe is the Abrahamic Covenant.
And what about church?
The word ecclesia is very interesting because in the Septuagint, the community of Israel is called the ecclesia of God. And yet Paul uses that same word, ecclesia, church, to describe the community of believers, those who are allegiant to Jesus.
So let's go back to conditional or unconditional. Where are we here?
It's interesting. So let's take the Abrahamic Covenant. At first, in chapter 12, it seemed pretty unconditional. I mean, he puts Abraham to sleep, cuts apart the animals, and God's the only one who walks through it in his vision. Then when we get to chapter 17, all the same promises are reissued to Abraham at kind of the sacrificing of Isaac, and yet a condition is put on it at that point.
Did God change his mind?
Maybe it was always conditional, and it's just the way it's written.
hard to get a handle on this.
But it seems when you take chapter 17 that Abraham's promises are conditional upon those who are faithful.
There's sometimes we just don't have all the answers or all the cards, and this is one. I mean, I've heard people make statements about the Abrahamic Covenant of it is this, and we just don't really know. That was honestly between Abraham and God, and so maybe it's not for us to know necessarily. And then what about Sinai? You mentioned that one earlier too.
Disobedience pretty much always was promised to end up in exile, so there's definitely, I don't think anybody would dispute that there is a condition upon, I guess, that.
Now, we use the word divorce a lot in our current culture. I mean, we talked about it before, and there's kind of an idea of that.
Jeremiah 7, it almost indicates that God divorces Israel.
What about Davidic Covenant?
Davidic Covenant, when we get into that, it pretty much seems, we said, unilateral. It's God promising to always have someone on the throne. And, I mean, we kind of have to take that one spiritually because or else we got to take it as conditional.
Yeah.
Because after David's kids, Solomon was on the throne and he had kids on the throne, but there wasn't from the exile on really a king in Judah or in Israel. And we have Jesus as fulfilling that, but that's kind of fulfilled spiritually.
And this is where I just say sometimes God's plan kind of got all mucked up by people.
Yeah.
And so God's got these covenants, he's got these plans, he's trying to make this work, but it's like we kind of see him just saying, work with me, guys, like,
come on,
let's go, you know? And so, but still through that, we see this amazing faithfulness of God, even when the people aren't faithful.
Yep.
So God allowed the nation of Judah and David's line to be destroyed, you might even say displaced. Is the Davidic covenant over?
No, because God took that covenant fully on himself. He didn't give a condition to David to fulfill it. Yeah, I think it was encapsulated kind of within the other covenants that were conditional, perhaps, because you kind of see them all stacking up, overlapping in certain places.
Yeah, and I've mentioned in other films like the Scarlet Harlot talk being covenant, and you see that in David's line, the Messianic line, and so it's important how these things all connect to each other. And I wish we had time to go through and break every one of them apart and really hone in on it, but it's pretty awesome the way that puzzle fits together.
Yep. We're getting a new covenant.
New covenant, yep. So when is the new covenant fulfilled? That's what everybody wants to know.
Yeah, it seems in Jeremiah 31 that it's made between Israel and Judea, this covenant. But then we see Jesus inaugurating the new covenant in his blood in the upper room with the 12.
Yep.
Now, Israel and Judea are the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
And then you got the disciples, 12 disciples in the upper room, being the symbolic, fulfillment of the 12 tribes, and making the new covenant in his blood in the upper room, and then they are the ones sent out to regather the nations. So I think that's kind of cool fulfillment.
Jesus is always doing things a little bit differently than what people thought.
In the way that we see him at face value.
Yeah, and so, the disciples who walked with him every day almost for 3 years, they're just not getting a lot of this. And I think we see this, that it was kind of not the letter, but it was kind of the spirit that was happening there.
Yep.
What about making the new covenant obsolete, let's say?
Yeah, or the old covenant, it says, is either fading away or being made obsolete, and I believe that's the book of Hebrews, right?
Hebrews 8. Yeah.
Yep, and so we see, if we tie that into our 70 AD partial preterist eschatology, we see that when the temple's destroyed, not the need for sacrifice anymore, and the need for obeying all of the letter of the law, but obeying the spirit of the law is what is carried forward. It's kind of the vindication of Jesus in that he has inaugurated this new covenant in the upper room, and this is basically the fading away of the old covenant.
So the question is the old covenant, does it become obsolete? It's a great question to ask, because there's still a lot of people that say, should we still be exercising, especially if you're a Jew, should you still exercise some of the old law? And a lot of times you hear the people say, well, if Jesus did it and we're to be like Jesus, then why not? Shouldn't we be doing that? And so it's a great question, and it flushes out in eschatology of when does that old covenant end? When does the new one start? And will the new covenant ever end?
Yeah, it's I think 70 AD plays a whole lot into that based on how you interpret it. If you don't think that is kind of the culmination, then, both of these are kind of up for grabs.
Yeah, yep. And you see the covenant fulfilled with Jesus. And so as it's fulfilled, how does this play into the idea of a future millennium?
Yeah, that it's interesting. Are we playing that out now? Is it already? Is it not yet? Some people think that the new covenant hasn't actually been fulfilled, and that this actual regathering of all the Jewish tribes or something is going to happen in the end days or in the millennium or something like that. But we see it as fulfilled.
Yeah.
When you look at, take a Deuteronomy 32 worldview we talked about. Yeah. You look at the table of nations in Genesis 10, and you look at the nations that were in Israel, and the Spirit was poured out in Acts 2. They overlap, and it's the purpose of God regrafting in, bringing in the lost tribes, and also bringing in the Gentiles.
Yeah. So there's a couple hang-up things that sometimes people have, is they say, well, what happens to Satan? When is he cast into this abyss?
Yeah, we see that he's bound now. It doesn't say that just because he's bound doesn't mean he's not active.
Right.
It just means his power is limited.
Yeah. So there's two thoughts. Could Christ's work on the cross have theoretically cast him into the abyss? Is that what it means by Satan is bound? Or does that mean that this is yet to happen, maybe when Christ comes back?
It could be either way.
They're all good questions.
They are, and we'll get into a millennium conversation maybe in the future here as one of our episodes.
All right. So in conclusion, we've got Israelites. They're light bearers.
Mm-hmm.
We've got covenants that point to regathering of the nations.
Yeah, so the dispensational futurist thinking of the split Israel and Gentile church, we see doesn't actually make a ton of sense when you look at the covenants.
Yeah, hard to put that one together.
It's really hard to make this square with all this covenant stuff that we just went through that saw that the purpose of Abraham, the covenant with Abraham, was to go for all nations.
Yeah.
And we saw the land fulfilled. We have a king in Jesus.
Right.
We have all of this fulfilled already in Jesus and at the cross.
Yep.
And so there isn't a reason to see a distinction or promises made to Israel that weren't kept in dispensational thinking.
So the hard thing is what do we do with Israel here?
Mm-hmm.
What happens to them? Where do they land? Are they the stepchild that just is kind of cast away at this point? Or are they the same as Gentiles now? I mean, where are they? What do we do with them?
Well, I think it's always been by faith. God is looking for a relationship, and he's looking for people to be allegiant to him. He used Israel for that purpose, but not all were faithful, we see.
Yeah.
This is specifically Paul's argument in Romans 9-11, is that what was the purpose of Israel if they're not faithful?
Yeah.
He said their purpose was still, God used them to be a light to the nations and to bring about the Messiah.
Right.
And that was the purpose of Israel. It's still, nobody is saved apart from God's grace and apart from faith.
Yeah.
And so whether you're Israelite or not, whether you're Gentile or not, it all comes down to, are you allegiant to God?
It's remnant
Theology, yep. And that's what the remnants were, the ones who were faithful.
Yep, those set apart to do the willing to be allegiant, to do the work of God, and that's what belief meant. And so that's what we have. Are we going to get real into it and try to figure out exactly how that plays out? In a way, it just doesn't even really matter.
No.
Yeah. Last thing, what about all these promises? Where are we at here? Have they all already? Not yet? What are we waiting for? I see all the time, particularly on internet posts right now, here's a list of things that need to happen before the end of the world.
I see that they've all been fulfilled. I mean, except for Jesus' coming again, as he promised.
Yeah.
So his second coming in the flesh hasn't happened yet in the final judgment, but it seems that every other promise you can find a fulfillment in Jesus.
So if that's your view, our view, how do we know when the Messiah is coming back?
We just don't. He says he will. He's been faithful, as we've seen in all these other promises. So we are holding on to the trust that we have in God and knowing that if he's been faithful in the past, he's going to be faithful in the future.
And that's why life hasn't really changed much in the last few weeks.
We still have our commission to go and make disciples and to teach them to obey him, and that's what we should be focusing on in this time.
May God bless you and keep you.